Hello, I'm Somi Arian. I'm a tech philosopher and the founder of InPeak. My guest on today's podcast is Cyphr, the founder of gmDAO, a community of NFT collectors, artists, and investors created in 2021 through a fair token distribution. There's a lot in this interview to learn about DAOs and art collecting. So let's dive right in. So you're the founder of gmDAO, right?
That's right, yes.
Okay, so I thought this would be an opportunity for me to learn more about gmDAO from your own words and kind of like get an understanding of your background, how you got into it. So it's my understanding that gmDAO is basically an art curation type of token, right? Or community, right? So people buy a token that will then give them access to drops that you have curated. So is it in that sense, would you say it's a bit like similar to proof?
Yeah. So from an outside perspective, I can understand why you have that impression that the GM token is effectively just a mint pass. Although that wasn't what it was originally intended for. So there are two main parts to gmDAO currently. There's the DAO, which is obviously the community, and then there's the studio, gmStudio, which is one of our first products which we've launched. And I can get into detail as to why we launched that and how we went about that. But yeah, one of the main kind of attractors to people to the DAO currently is the fact that anything that we launch on the studio, gmDAO members are automatically whitelisted, or sorry, allow listed to those drops. So that's one of the main perks, certainly, but that wasn't the original intention of the token.
Okay, so what was the original intention, and how did that change come about?
So there was no original intention, funnily enough. So the story is, so basically, my background, kind of answering this question in kind of in one fell swoop, is in digital marketing. That was my original professional background. Specifically, I worked in business development. So I always found it interesting as to why certain content went viral, and just generally how communities formed on social media. And I basically was fortunate enough to experience that firsthand by owning a Bored Ape in the very early stages. And I was kind of fascinated by the community aspect behind NFTs, and I basically decided at one point that I wanted to see if I could replicate that on my own. I didn't have any sort of skill set to actually, I'm not an artist myself. I didn't necessarily want to go down the path of creating an art project, but I did want to see if I could try and replicate the community aspect. But rather than build it around a project or anything else, I wanted to see if it could be done based on a viral marketing campaign effectively. And so towards the end of 2021, I basically announced that I was going to be saying GM every single day for 100 days. And the first 10 people that would respond to those tweets would be able to claim one of these tokens, which was the DAO token. And I wasn't really expecting many people to be interested or to even participate. So there was even a mechanic that said that on days that we didn't have 10 people replying, that the tokens would get burnt, essentially. But that didn't happen very regularly. People, for whatever reason, got really excited about the idea, and there was people developing bots and scripts to reply to all of my tweets, no matter what they were. But what it kind of resulted in was a really, really passionate community. A lot of the initial members were obviously followers of mine, as you'd expect. But I've always had an interest in generative art, and well, actually, I say always. I mean, since I've been in the NFT space, I've always been fascinated by generative art. That's where I've been leaning towards. So there were naturally a lot of people who were also actively involved in this space or were artists themselves.
So you said for 100 days. So how many tokens there are now?
So if there was 10 for 100 days, so there was originally meant to be 1,000 tokens. But as I said, there were some days where people didn't respond, or sometimes there are actually people didn't end up claiming the tokens. So we ultimately ended up deciding as a community at the end of that 100-day period, we decided what should we do with these tokens that aren't going to be claimed, and we voted as a DAO to burn them. And so the final number is 900 tokens. So, and that's quite funny because obviously at the time they were worthless, those tokens. They were on OpenSea, I think one sold maybe for like $10, whereas now obviously they're trading at I think 3 ETH and been up to 6 ETH. So there's been a lot of people who've come back to me like a year later saying, hey, by the way, can I get that token now? I forgot to claim it. And I have to say, I'm sorry, they've been destroyed, they've been burnt. But yeah, that was the original idea. And yeah, it's obviously evolved since then. But yeah, that's how it all started.
I so empathize with that, because when we released our Genesis token, it was 0.1, and so many people didn't mint, like the mint didn't go very well in the beginning that day.
The psychology behind minting, I think people could write dissertations or on this type of mentality. It's really interesting. People need to see that momentum. And, we've definitely experienced that, not so much with we did to a certain extent experience it with the DAO tokens, but really with the studio, with the drops, we're fortunate that we never had an instance where we haven't minted out very, very quickly. But we definitely have seen, we've had to try and play around a lot with our drop mechanics to try and make sure that we do maintain momentum, because, even though we've been fine on the actual drop itself, or the minting of the collections, we've seen how momentum can really impact the secondary volume and how people, because there's an entire different mentality there as well. Like you mentioned, people didn't want to mint it, but they buy it at 0.5. And it is really like people take these things seriously, that they'll use analytics to see how many buyers there are, like, and things like velocity, all that kind of stuff. So it's really important. So I sympathize with it.
Well, yeah, it is. I don't know if to say it's important necessarily is the issue is that type of mentality doesn't apply to every type of token. Like there are tokens that are collectibles, that are PFPs, etc. But for us, it's like a membership token, to an educational platform. So the Genesis token is for people, for thought leaders who want to give lessons on the platform, who want to build, who want to create content, that want us to support building their profile. So it's more for basically builders, thought leaders, educators, and content creators. And then the Gen 2 token is for people who want to learn. But in general, I'm like, I just always trying to think that people buy tokens for the wrong reason. If you're buying it because simply because of the value going up and flipping, then that's not necessarily the right reason for our type of business. So how do you manage that? So you now have those 900 token holders, and is it like 900 unique token holders? Or I heard somebody just recently did a sweep of your floor. Who was that?
That was Danny, aka Cyphr. So
he does that with a lot of things, right? Like, because I've heard that he's also sweeped creeps.
Yeah, I think he when he likes a project or when he sees potential, he doesn't hold back. He tends to just go full in head first. So he did that. Yeah, I think he's done that with a number of projects. He's done that with art blocks in the past. He did that with all of our studio collections, I believe. So he shows a lot of conviction, which is awesome. But yeah, I mean, I sympathize as well. People buying in for the wrong reasons. I think it's very hard to avoid. When something has monetary value, and they see the number going up, then you will have speculators no matter what, unfortunately. I think it's just the nature of the space right now. I don't think we'll ever get to a time where there won't be speculators. And it is frustrating because, especially as a DAO, where we really want tokens in the hands of people who are going to contribute and going to participate in the community, There are, so to answer your question, no, it's not one token, and it's not, so the number of unique holders, I believe, is around 800. So there are people who hold multiple tokens, but in terms of actual active users, I would say it's probably around 600, 650, something like this. So there's around, 200 tokens, 250 tokens who are just sat in wallets of people who are either speculators or passive investors, or maybe they use it for the studio mints, but they don't actively participate in the community, which is a shame. But I think it's unavoidable. Unfortunately, when there's money involved, people will always speculate.
Yeah, which is why for our next drop, we are going to soulbound tokens actually. I think for us, that's the right kind of answer. So since you've launched, how long is it, and how many art drops have you had?
So the DAO launched on September in 2021, and then the studio was launched it was conceptualized in December of 2021, but I think it officially launched in January of 2022. And since January, we've dropped 5 collections.
So what's the difference? So the DAO and then the studio. Tell me a little bit more about how this mechanic works.
So as I said, the studio is the first product that we launched as a DAO. So as I mentioned, when the community was first kind of created, there was no product, or it was really just based on an idea or on a thought experiment. But as I mentioned, there were a lot of people who were actively involved in the gen art space, a lot of artists, and when we initially sat down together to brainstorm as to what we could potentially build, that was one of the natural paths that we saw in front of us was a gen art platform, because we basically said what is missing today, what's lacking, and a lot of the artists said we have art to share, but it's very difficult for us to publish new works because the options are very limited. At the time, there was art blocks, and to a lesser extent, there was gen art as well. But they each had their own problems. Art blocks was at that stage very, very popular, still is, obviously. And for up and coming artists, it's quite challenging to have collections launched there, not necessarily because the quality of the work is good enough, but just because they have so much interest that their wait times are so long. And the way that they select work, their curation process was somewhat opaque. So it wasn't really obvious to the artists as to why their collections might get accepted or not. And so we took on board all of that feedback when actually building the studio. So one of the main differentiators is the fact that we implement a blind curation process, which means that our curation panel, who are all DAO members, they review every submission blindly. So they don't know any of the information about the artist. They judge it purely based on merit and based on what they see. And we feel that this allows new artists, somebody who maybe has never launched anything in the past, have a fair opportunity to be able to launch their collections. Because that's another aspect of art blocks, is that they actually evaluate submissions also based on the artist's portfolio and their previous work, whereas we feel that that's not representative of where they are today. That's more a representation of their journey, and we didn't feel that was necessary. So so as I mentioned, back in July, we officially launched with our first collection called Mind the Gap, and we've only launched 5 collections, and that's not to say that we couldn't launch more, but because our curation is blind, we don't have any sort of investors or things like this. We don't have to launch unless we feel that we have collections that are of a certain standard. So we're really trying to position ourselves as the ultra curated platform, where we only launch stuff when we feel we found something of a very, very high quality.
And when these launches happen, the number of tokens, what are the number of tokens? So is it like only if you have a gmDAO token that you can get those?
No, so the thinking, and this has evolved since we've done each drop, but where we've landed today is that if you hold a DAO token, your wallet is automatically allow listed for the drops. In reality, that doesn't mean that the entirety of the drop goes to the DAO, because as I mentioned, there's only around 600 to 650 active members, and not all of the members are actually interested in Gen Art. So I would say on average, we see around 500 mints coming from the DAO, which means whatever's left over for that collection goes to the general public. And previously, I would say most of our drops have been around 900 pieces or close to 1,000 pieces. So that means that around a 50-50 split between the DAO and the public. So that's typically how it's worked up to now. But yeah, that's not to say that one of the challenges, I suppose, is that if we launch smaller collections, we're going to have to think of ways in which we can accommodate the DAO aspect. But also, one of the things we've always tried to maintain, and to a certain extent, is that public aspect as well. Because I think we don't necessarily want, because obviously you mentioned that the DAO was a mint pass, which it essentially is, but we don't want it to be perceived purely as a mint pass. First and foremost, it's a DAO token, it's a governance token. And that's kind of a perk, is that mint aspect, but we don't want to kind of enforce or reinforce that view that it's purely a mint pass.
Awesome. So tell me a little bit about the mechanics of the DAO. So you guys make all the decisions together? Is it vote based, or is there a more of a centralized leadership at all? How does that work? All the mechanics of running something like that with 600-700 people active?
Yeah, it's a great question, and it's quite timely as well, because you mentioned the legal aspect. We're currently in the final stages of actually incorporating, but yeah, it's a challenge, I'll admit. So it's really about striking a balance between decentralization, but there needs to be a level of centralization in some areas to actually get things done. So in the early stages, when we were building the studio, to build something, obviously you need people to volunteer. At that stage, we didn't have a huge amount of funding. In fact, I'd say we had pretty much no funding within our treasury. So it was just a question of finding people who would raise their hands, who wanted to, actually develop the product or work on the product. And we saw very early on that when you do these when you try to get people to work on a voluntary basis, stuff just doesn't get done. You need to empower people to actually make decisions, and who can actually kind of steer the product or steer the project and take ownership of it. Because, as I said, otherwise things just stagnate and nothing gets done. And to a certain extent, that's true of the DAO as a whole. So all of the proposals, anyone is able to make a proposal. All of the one token equals one vote. So in that sense, it functions as a DAO. I heard, obviously I'm biased in saying this, but I hear a lot of the members saying that we're one of the few DAOs that actually operates truly as a DAO. But that isn't to say that there aren't aspects which are more centralized. So if there are basically we try to organize ourselves into working groups. So if there are, people who are more interested in managing the treasury, or if there are people who want to focus on the studio, we organize them into working groups, and then we empower those working groups to make decisions on behalf of that area of the DAO. But the way that we empower them is still done in a democratic way. So any sort of executive powers that we give somebody have to be voted by the DAO. And, it's generally, it's as if we're giving them a contract. So we only have four full-time employees currently in the DAO, including myself. But they have very clear responsibilities as to what they do. And all of those responsibilities, as I mentioned, were voted through by the DAO as a whole.
Super interesting. I'm really interested in exploring the mechanics of DAOs. Do you think that DAOs will ever be able to achieve the level of growth that a company can?
Well, I think there already are examples of DAOs that have. It depends how you define a company. If it's just around their book value or their treasuries, there are certainly DAOs that are that would be considered VCs at this stage. So I think we're already there, but I definitely understand what you're saying around agility and DAOs having to be, by nature, they take longer. So I can definitely see that as DAOs grow in terms of, well, I guess maturity, in terms of revenue and all types of different metrics, that they will gravitate towards more centralization in certain areas to give them the flexibility they need to grow or to operate. Because, for example, with us, the studio, for instance, it doesn't operate as a DAO. It really operates as a business in a lot of ways, because we need that agility to actually make decisions. If we had to have a vote for every minute operational change, nothing again would it wouldn't function. We need to make certain decisions quickly. I think that's fine, so long as the DAO has ultimate authority in terms of they don't that the studio, for instance, or that entity or working group doesn't have impunity. It can make these decisions quickly, but if they fuck up in some way, then the DAO has the ability to cut them off, let's say. So I think as long as you're able to maintain the ethos of a DAO as a whole, the DAO still was able to maintain full control, have ultimate kind of the final say. I think it's okay that there are certain levels of centralization, but I also appreciate there are some people who argue wholeheartedly against that, and they would. We've had people leave the DAO for that reason. Very few, but there are some people who say, like, this isn't how a DAO should operate, and they've ultimately left, and that's fine. I understand, but I also think that ideal vision of how a DAO should function is also not very efficient and is not very practical either.
Yeah, 100%. And I wonder if there might be a time where, if you are in a lot of DAOs, that there might be a time where we delegate our decision making to AI. I don't know if you have explored that, but I was like thinking, for example, I've recently joined Rock Radio, and I was like looking at their Discord, and I was like, oh my God, there's so many things that they're asking me to vote on, and I'm like, I don't have time to read all of this, right? So if there was an AI assistant, if we are going as a community more and more in that direction, and if eventually governance becomes more and more decentralized as a whole as well, if there was an AI assistant that was so clearly closely following me as a person, right, and knowing what I think and how I think, and could help make those decisions for me. But on the other hand, I can see how that could be a slippery slope, because if that AI assistant knows everything about me, could potentially also impact my decisions in certain ways. I'm fascinated by this topic as a tech philosopher, but have you seen any signs of these types of automation, or are people using these technologies in any way?
So certainly not within our DAO. I mean, the furthest we've gotten is just kind of manual delegation to voting rights to another individual. But then again, that kind of goes back to the argument of, like, is it really a DAO? That essentially you're just centralizing the voting power onto certain individuals. So it kind of defeats the purpose, in my opinion. It's very interesting, that concept of having an AI vote on your behalf. I've never heard of that before. I have some experience with machine learning. I wouldn't personally trust an AI to vote on my behalf. I don't know what kind of data set it would be using to learn like my voting habits, but it doesn't. It definitely is a challenge. I will say, like, getting people to actively vote and participate in votes is a very, very big challenge. I mentioned we have around 600 active members, but we struggle sometimes to get 100 votes on very important proposals. So I think even if it's not AI, having any sort of system that could help automate the voting process, but retaining the democratic aspect of a DAO, that would be an advantage. But I personally haven't experienced or seen any good solutions to that.
Well, there's a good business idea. I think that we will get there. As we go towards this singularity, you know, But yeah, it might take some time. I mean, Ray Kurzweil, I don't know if you know him. He's the author of The Singularity is Near. He has argued that by the end of this decade, we will have machine learning basically artificial general intelligence, which would be like, that machines can understand things the way that we do, maybe better. So that would be very interesting. Sometimes it feels to me that technology is moving so fast, and sometimes it feels like it's still so slow when it comes to things like this. There's so much context, and it's quite hard still for machines to understand context. Sometimes they respond in a way that it looks like they're understanding context, but then when you get to the nitty gritty and dive deeper, then it doesn't. So speaking of AI, with regards to the kind of artist that you're working on and with generative art, so how much are you seeing the use of AI in generative art, and where do you think it will go in the coming years?
So, I mean, I would argue that AI art isn't generative. So I know that's controversial, and some people will have different opinions on this. But the way I classify generative art is a set of outputs or set of art that's generated through code, or rather a system that's infinitely replicable. And I guess in some ways you could say AI art does fall into that category, but I'm thinking for the studio's purposes, we only work with art that's generated through code. And again, AI art, I guess you could say, is art that is generated by code, and we mean specifically written code. So we've kind of taken a stance where we wouldn't launch an AI created collection currently. That isn't to say that I am not personally a fan of AI art. We are seeing it a lot more. I see it on my feed very, very often, and it's quite unfair. Sometimes I'll scroll through my feed. Basically my entire feed on Twitter is just art, gen art, and sometimes I'll see a piece which I'll be blown away by, and then I'll see that it's AI based, and I'll be a little bit disappointed because I feel like that's almost cheating in some ways. But that isn't to say that it's definitely becoming more prominent. Are you familiar with this is kind of unrelated, but are you familiar with DeviantArt as a platform?
No.
It's quite an old platform, but it's basically originally was a website where illustrators and kind of drawn artists could share their work, but it's become much more of a digital platform now, and they've recently kind of created a feature, like they're really leaning into the AI aspect now, and they created several filters now which allows you to kind of completely filter out AI based art, because there's just so much of it on the platform now. And yeah, it's becoming a bit of a hot topic, because it's all about, like, people are now using original artwork as kind of training sets for their AI models, and kind of replicating art that looks extremely similar but is different. And it kind of blurs the line between, like, what is original art, what does that apply with copyright and all that kind of stuff. So going on a bit of a tangent, like, I think it's a really interesting space. I'm not personally the biggest fan, although I can see that the visual appeal is definitely there. But yeah, it's an interesting subject.
Yeah, definitely. I'm fascinated by that topic. I've written a book about the future of work where I talked about generative art and music, and there's been experiments where music has been created in the style of Bach, that especially uses some of Bach's work that is maybe not some of his most famous ones, and then people have listened to that and they've actually picked the one that was created by AI over the real Bach. and thinking, and they have thought that that was Bach, so even Bach enthusiasts and people who are like listening to it all the time, they couldn't tell the difference. And likewise, people going into galleries and actually preferring work that is generated by AI. I don't think there's anything wrong with that. I actually I'm actually fascinated by it. I think maybe I'm a little bit more AI enthusiast than most people, but I think that the real value and the real interesting part comes in when AI and human is combined, and human is human creativity is enhanced by AI. But the truth is that it is, the technology is taking over so many aspects of what we would do, and in many ways it does it better. So yeah, so what's the future for what you're building now? Where do you think you will be in, let's say, 2-3 years?
So for us personally, I mean, we're only a year old. So and if you'd asked me the same question a year ago, I would never have guessed where how far we've come. I can see the seeds have been planted for a number of new ventures from within the DAO. So I'm really hopeful that we can follow through on those and have, not just the studio, but I would say, 3, 4, maybe 5 other ventures within a year's time. I don't know how, I don't want to go into too much detail because I don't want to kind of jinx it, and I don't know, I don't want to. Other people are working on these, and I think that's the most exciting part. Is I think the DAO and the studio are definitely my personal kind of passion projects, but I love seeing other people take their own initiatives, and I want them to follow through with it, and I don't want to kind of spoil the surprise. But that for me is what I'm really excited about, is seeing other working groups forming within the DAO, because for me, that's what a DAO is all about. It's about, a lot of people join with the expectation of, what is the DAO going to do for me? What is it going to bring me? I've paid money to be here. What's going to be my return? But the mentality should really be, what can I do to contribute? How can I leverage the talent that's within this community to build something of my own? And I love seeing that when people take on that initiative. So that's, kind of dodging the question. That's what I want to see in the next year. I would hope that there are these new ventures coming from the DAO. Where the space is going, God, if I could tell you, I'd be a multimillionaire. I think, because I would probably be investing in certain areas. God, I'm trying to think of something to say for that. I don't know. I mean, I hope we can just mature a little bit in general. You talked about how I think a lot of the NFT space in particular is fueled by speculation and investors, or speculative investors. I would love to see the gen art space really becoming more collector focused, and people being less interested in money and more interested in just stuff that looks nice and that they can enjoy. I think we are getting there. If you compare where we were at a year ago versus today, I think there a lot of the initial speculators are leaving. So I hope we just mature in that way. Maybe it's a big ask, but yeah. And then again, that's not a prediction. That's just a wish. But that's what I would like to see.
Yeah, same here. I have the same wish, and I think that there are things that we can do as founders to steer the ship in that direction, and get people to become more interested in the underlying aspect of what the builders are trying to do, and the kind of values that they're trying to bring. Well, thank you so much for sharing your experience and perspective. It's really interesting how you built this, and I really
Yeah, thank you for having me, and I'll be happy to meet your community and answer their questions as well. So yeah, thanks
Awesome.
again.
I hope you enjoyed this conversation with Cyphr from the gmDAO. Be sure to follow him on Twitter and check out their work at the gmDAO. And don't forget to give it a 5-star rating and write a review. The full interviews are also available on my YouTube channel, the Somi Arian Show.